go ahead? Hello and welcome everyone. Oh, can you check with the echo? I think the conversation's already begun. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here and live on streaming. I hope you've clicked on the YouTube link that we shared with all of you. But thank you so much for being here. It's my pleasure to introduce the person who will introduce the two speakers today, Suneet Tandon, the Director of India Habitat Center, a very, very good partner in this collaboration, the InfraKatha series. This is the 8th edition of the InfraKatha series. And I want to tell you a little bit about Suneet Tandon, although I think everyone knows him. Everyone knows him as a performer and as the president of Delhi Music School, which he says he just does by the way. That's one of the many things he does. But, you know, he's been at NFDC, he's headed IFFI, he's headed IIMC. And I think apart from the fact that you have to have tremendous management skills to do all this and terrific people skills, I think what he's done to Habitat Center, and I think it's very important, is to create a public space for conversation, for discourse, for performance, for just people to meet each other. And I think for a city like Delhi, or indeed for any other city, that's a very important thing. And I think our CEO will agree with that. As an architect, we don't have enough public spaces in the city where you can actually meet and talk to each other without an agenda. So the InfraKatha series is actually a series without an agenda, except, of course, at the back of our minds is infrastructure. So, Suneet, may I request you please to come to the stage and introduce the two speakers today? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaveri. You know, as I come up here for this very, very special event, which we have been looking forward to for quite some time because of the guest who is going to be addressing us and will be in conversation with Vinayak, I am also reminded of the many, many conversations on urbanization which we held in this very hall with the late Ishar Judge Ahluwalia, who, as the sort of head of a career, had initiated that series and was very, very passionate about carrying it on right up to the very end. So my deepest homage to Ishar, and it's great to have you here, Montek, and we remember her very, very fondly. But today we have Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. It's, you know, as one says, he needs no introduction, but I think it is important to just recount a few of the sort of highlights of any person who's going to speak, just to remind us of the tremendous achievements of the person we are going to be hearing shortly. He's had several important positions, including Special Secretary to the Indian Prime Minister, Commerce Secretary, Secretary Department of Economic Affairs, Finance Secretary. He was also a member of the Planning Commission and the member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. He was also a director of the Independent Evaluation Office International Monetary Funds. He holds a BA Honours Economics degree from Delhi University, MA and MPhil from Oxford University. But of course, above all, he's a very distinguished economist and has served as the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission for the Government of India from 2004 to 2014 and was a key figure in the economic reforms of the 90s. We are very pleased to have you, sir, on this forum. And in conversation with Mr. Ahluwalia will be my old friend Vinayak Chatterjee, graduated in economics from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University, and did his MBA from the IIM Ahmedabad. He co-founded Feedback Infra Private Limited in 1990 and served as its chairman from 90 to 2021. And since stepping down from active management, he now devotes his time and energy to infrastructure policy and advocacy, which this is part of that, as well as to nurturing educational institutions. He founded this Infravision Foundation, which is collaborating with us in this InfraKatha series in 2022 to help shape thought leadership and drive policy intervention in infrastructure. May I invite both of you please to come up onto the dais and carry this evening forward.
Always. I'm just going to stand up and do a little stage setting before I completely pass on the baton to Shri Montek Ahluwalia. What I thought I'd do is, since we're discussing PPP, I thought I'd just take 5 minutes to do a little bit of history tracing on infrastructure, the stages of infrastructure development in the country. I'm starting from 1947 to 1992. Many decades, which basically saw public expenditure, around 2.5 to 3% of GDP, which, as you remember, sir, we both jointly unleashed the GCFI, the gross capital formation in infrastructure. So those days it was about 2.5 to 3%, when the Hindu rate of growth of GDP was around 3% or whatever. Then came the phase 1992 to 1997, which I'm calling phase 2 of India's infrastructure development series, which is the early stages of PPP. People don't remember that, but Spectrum's Kakinada and GVK's Jagrupadu power plants were 2 of the 8 fast-track projects approved by the government in 1992 under PPP mode. And also, India's first PPP toll road, people have forgotten, was a small 12-kilometer long Rao Pitampur road in Madhya Pradesh, developed by ILFS, and that created waves saying, by God, we have a 12-kilometer road that people pay toll on. That was news in 1992. 1997 to 2007, I'm calling the phase 3, which is the unleashing of PPP. And that 1997, to my mind, for infrastructure researchers and watchers, was a very interesting year. It saw a whole set of activities coming together. The most important was Rakesh Mohan's seminal report, the India Infrastructure Report, which fundamentally at its heart had the thesis that private capital should be used to build large swaths of infrastructure, followed quickly by setting up the Infrastructure Development Finance Corporation in 1997 by Mr. Chidambaram as Finance Minister, headquartered in Chennai, and the vision statement for IDFC that was announced in Parliament at that time was to lead private capital to infrastructure. That was a vision of IDFC. Forget the fact that it's a retail bank now. Then was the formation of the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, Tariff Authority of Major Ports, and very importantly, an ordinance was introduced which brought into being the apex regulators in the electricity sector at both the center and the states. Please remember, this is the period 1997 to the unleashing of PPP, that stage, till 2007. But 1997, seminal year. Now come to the heights of PPP, which is phase 4, 2007 and 2012. When Prime Minister Manmohan Singh announced from the ramparts of the Red Fort that he wanted private sector to unleash animal spirits in infrastructure development. And you presided then over, sir, probably the biggest peak in private capital that happened in Indian infrastructure, phase 4, the heights of PPP. Very, very aggressive development of Indian entrepreneurship, of funding, of banks, of institutions, all that happened in this phase. And the Planning Commission in those days, I remember, was very, very strongly monitoring the extent of private capital coming in, and plan after plan, it rose from almost 0 in the early 90s. It rose to 22% in the 11th plan, to 37% in the 12th plan. And I'm aware of the fact that when 13th plan was being drafted, because I was interacting with your colleagues at that time, sir, and the plan was to take it anywhere around 45 to 49%, that half of India's infrastructure will be built by private capital, but there was no 13th plan. So that was the very aggressive phase of PPP, 2007 to 2012, and then came the big crash, which I'm calling phase 5, the stage of NPAs, non-performing assets, what Raghuram Rajan subsequently called the twin balance sheet problem, and the ill effects of over-exuberance across many, many investments, which almost led to a NPA block of close to 18 lakh crores, for which the government, the UPA government in its last year had to set up a special cabinet committee under the chairmanship of an IAS officer, under the chairmanship of the cabinet secretary, but led by an IAS officer called Anil Swarup to try and clean up that mess. 18 lakh crores was a big figure, and it put the fear of God into private sector balance sheets and banks and everybody else saying, no, we are not touching PPP anymore. So that was phase 5, which is 2012 to 2014. And come 2014 and we have a change of government. And that I'm calling phase 6. So the new government comes in 2014 and says, look, we have inherited all this, 18 lakh worth of NPAs, double twin balance sheet problem, nobody wanting to touch PPP. So what the hell, we are not going to waste time. We are going to now ignore private capital and we are going to build the country with EPC. So we have this phase of EPC from 2014 to 2020, where even I remember public fora, I remember at a CI meeting, Mr. Gadkari waved aside private capital and he said, we don't really need it anymore. I have enough budgetary allocation to complete the National Highway Development Program. And there was a general mood away from PPP. Then we come to phase 7, which is 2020 to 2023, which I call the monetization jugalbandi. So at one level, the government announced the National Investment Plan, NIP. That was, I suspect, the last document that came out when Atanu Chakravarti was Secretary of Finance, and the NIP was announced by the Finance Minister. And 1 year later, the National Monetization Plan was announced to say that while PPP is scared of coming into greenfield development, surely there's a lot of capital willing to come into brownfield operating assets, which was right, because the large pension funds, etc., all were keen to take up InvITs, REITs, and etc. So this phase of Jugalbandi happened in the phase 2020 to 2023. And as we speak now, and I'm just going to stop here and pass the baton to Montek, to say that in this phase we are living now, 2023 to 2024, there is again a lot of talk in the government about revival of PPP. And in the last budget speech, Madam Sitaraman actually had, after a long time, 3 paragraphs on PPP, which said we are setting up a separate cell under the Department of Economic Affairs to push PPP. And we know from friends in the World Bank that the World Bank was also asked to prepare a paper and advise the government on revival of PPP. So I thought I'd just do this little stage setting to say that we've gone through huge stages of learning. And these are 8 stages of development of Indian infrastructure. And I have many, many questions for Montek, and I'm sure we'd enjoy an open house also because people would want an interaction. But the first question I'm going to leave you with, sir, is that the fundamental principle of PPP in India and anywhere in the world was free public expenditure to develop areas where private capital would not come in: healthcare, education, nutrition, irrigation, etc. And wherever private capital could earn a return commensurate with the expectations of private capital, please open up these areas. And they were traditionally ports, airports, power, roads, where tolls could be collected, charges could be collected, user fees could be collected. And that was the fundamental economic thesis on which PPP rested. Question to you, sir, as a first of many other questions, is what happened to that? What happened to that political economic understanding which was the bedrock of PPP movements, not just in India, but across the developing world? Over to you, sir.
Thanks very much, Vinayak, and thank you for, thank the organizers in general. This is an important subject. May I suggest to everyone, why don't you come into the middle section? Because, it's nice to pretend that we have a very crowded audience, and there's a lot of you, but it'd be nice if one can look at all of you at one go, rather than sort of sweeping one's eye across the screen. Yeah. Now, Vinayak, you said what, look, governments very frequently announce visions, all governments, and if you ask 5 years later what happened to the vision, things change, that things are implemented differently. I certainly am not an expert to answer what happened in the last 10 years, because I'm only an observer from outside. So I have no idea what was going on inside. But I don't want to put it in the framework of this was supposed to happen and didn't happen. I mean, the fact is that whatever we do over a long time, there are vision statements, and then there's what happens. And I think that all said and done, you started off by the early 90s, then went through these various categories. I think it's certainly true that when we began the whole thing in the early 90s, there was actually generally a strong feeling that infrastructure should be done by the government. I remember when I was in the Prime Minister's office when Mr. Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister, I used to tell him that, look, should do more, give larger role to the private sector. And he was kind of willing to do that, but in his mind, infrastructure should remain public. I mean, that was the thinking. And that changed in 91. And I wouldn't, if you judge a change by whether it was seamlessly done, virtually all the changes we've made will come in for criticism. But there's no question that in this rather long period, things have changed. I mean, in the early 90s, people wouldn't believe that you could have an airport run by the private sector. When we started doing this, I remember the concept of minor port. The only ports that were private were minor ports. Every public sector ports were called major ports. And I pointed out that, look, 2 or 3 of these private ports are bigger than your so-called major ports. So don't call the private sector ports minor ports. So they said, okay, so we'll call them non-major ports. So we had major ports. Now you've got Mundra and all these huge ports. So I think things have changed in a messy way, but that's really the way all reforms in India have taken place. I think that, what you call public sector, if you like, PPP in infrastructure, I think you have to distinguish between a situation where you compete in the market and the other is you compete for the market. Now, these are 2 very different situations. I mean, for example, when you get rid of public sector monopoly in telecom, which is an infrastructure area, you throw it open to the private sector, and then the private sector competes in the market. I mean, you have old Jio and Airtel and Vodafone and also the public sector companies. They're competing for the same market, basically. And then the question always is are the terms of that competition fair? Similarly, when it comes to privatizing, let's say, Air India, Air India ends up competing in the market. But when you privatize a port, you're not competing in the market, you're competing for the market. I mean, you compete to get the concession to run this particular port. Once you get that, you are a monopoly supplier in that particular port. So I think the criteria are a bit different. However, in each case, I mean, the ultimate public test of whether the thing has gone well has to be, first of all, whether the quality of service has improved or not. I mean, if the quality of service has not improved, then the thing has failed. The second is it's possible that the quality of service has improved, but people feel that the terms on which the concession was given was unfair. And actually, a lot of, I would say that if we look back, there is virtually no doubt whatsoever that the quality of service being given by the private sector fellows is better than the quality of service being given by the public sector fellows. By the way, the most shocking thing about that is that I would have thought that that's a classic case for privatizing hotels. I am not aware of a single person who says to me, there are 2 hotels there, and I'm going to go to the public sector hotel because I think it's better run. Never heard that before. There were cases when I was in government when we would invite foreign delegations and put them up in the Ashoka Hotel, and they would privately lobby that, look, we don't want to go there, and can we go to some other hotel? They wouldn't say the hotels are bad, they just didn't want to go to the Ashoka. So, and by the way, the Ashoka Hotel is still gloriously public sector. You've been running this outfit, this whole area, both from the public side and the PPP side. So you should explain to us why that's so. Look at certain other things, like take telecom. I mean, it's a no-brainer that the telecom service has improved hugely. You know, I used to argue with Sam Petroda that, look, we should privatize the telecom. He wasn't in favor of it. In fact, when Mr. Gandhi was not in favor of privatizing telecom, but he was a great believer in telecom, and he was the original exponent that telecom is a people's thing. It's not meant for rich people. But he believed that it'll be rolled out better by the public sector. But you know, if you look at during Sam's period, the real innovation was public call offices. That's what was privatized. You know, the Kirana store ran a phone company, and that was wonderful. But actual privatization only happened in '92 when the telecom system was opened up to the private sector. And let me just put this off. So I think, but in telecom, the great kind of controversy was the terms on which these guys were allowed to come in. And you know, all the 2G, and was it right to allocate at the same price? I won't go into all of that. But the fact of the matter is, it's during that period where if you judge by the end result was fantastic, okay? I would say that in ports also, the end result is very good. By and large in roads, it's been good, I think, and is continuing to be good. You know, one of the things I remember is that people said, yeah, all this automatic tolls and all, ye nahi chalega. India won't. First of all, they said tolls won't work. You'll have a revolution. How can you charge anybody for going on? And happily, they're doing it and paying oodles of money and nobody cares, right? Then the sort of automation of this toll thing, fast tags, all of this, it seems to have worked quite well. But the issue really is always, was the concession given on the right terms or not? And I think linked to that is the feeling that when the government emphasizes infrastructure and you get a private sector guy who's given this concession, it's his business to find the money. And they tend to go to the banks and ask the banks to lend huge amounts of money. And most of the banks didn't do due diligence on whether these guys are capable of running these shows or not, etc., etc. Some of these projects ran into difficulty. The big bank thing was not the PPPs. The big bank, what you might call it, NPAs, included just standard steel plants and things like this, which were just normal businesses to whom they overlent and which were going through cycles. Plus, of course, a lot of these power projects, which had a lot of environmental clearance problems. So, you know, I mean, it's the central question, which, having given this rather discursive response, just to give you an idea that there are many, many different angles. I think the central question that Vinayak asked me was that isn't it the case that the reason you do PPPs is that government has lots of things to do which only the government can do, and if something can be done better by the private sector, the government shouldn't touch it. I completely agree with that. It is, by the way, absolutely true, even today, that the government has a huge amount of things to do which it's not doing adequately. Health, education, R&D, I mean, and particularly when you look at the geostrategic changes taking place around us, I mean, it would be not unreasonable to say that we are competing with China. They're 5 times bigger than us, so on, but still we're trying to compete. Now, you know, it would also be reasonable to say, well, how much are they spending on research and how much are we spending on research? And the result would be embarrassingly bad for us, which means that obviously that a lot of this has to be done by the private sector, but a lot has to be done by the public sector also, especially when it comes to research in agriculture and so on. So, you know, when you add up these things, plus defense, because we are not spending nearly enough on defense, given the kind of, if you like, the neighborhood that we live in. So if the government has to do all of these things, and the government has limits on its fiscal capabilities, they should undertake a very serious examination of whatever capital investment can be done by the private sector and stop doing it. And I don't think I don't know whether that is the policy, but it's a question we should ask. I mean, let me give you one area where there's been very little privatization, and I think there could have been a lot more, is railways. Now, I think when I was in the Planning Commission also, we had said that the redevelopment of the Delhi railway station, I mean, Delhi railway station is absurd in the sense that there's a lot of positive vibes about India right now, which is good. And I think those vibes are reinforced when somebody lands in either Mumbai or in Delhi. In fact, just before I left office, a good friend of mine, Stanley Fisher, who was then vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, came to Delhi for some meeting. And he sent me an email saying, I'm really impressed with the new airport. Congratulations, this is the first time you guys have done it. Now, I just wonder if the same fellow had gone to take a train journey to Delhi railway station, he would not have believed that we are ready to take off. So, I mean, we were very conscious of this. In fact, I had gone to Beijing. I was really impressed with what Beijing had done with the railways. And we tied our railways up with the Chinese railways people to say, look, could we not learn a little bit and so on. And interestingly, that arrangement had to be amended because I received a letter from the Planning Commission in China, it's called the National Commission for Development and Reform, that look, you signed this thing with the Railway Ministry, but we have to change this now because we abolished the Railway Ministry. There is no Railway Ministry. It's now become a corporation. I mean, we thought, we had said we should do something similar, and virtually everyone I know, including Rakesh Mohan, has been asked to do a thing on railway reform. Most recently, the late Vivek de Brois, sadly no longer with us, did an excellent report on railway reform.
In between, there was a Sam Pitroda report also.
That was a lot of it, but I think the hardcore stuff was these guys. And I mean, I looked at Vivek's report, and all the previous fellows who had written reports on the same subject came to me and said, there's not much original in it because ye to meri report mein bhi hai. So I said, look, if teri report mein hai aur nahi hua, so don't you want Vivek de Brois to say, but this should be done from now onwards. So in that sense, it was a very complete report, and I think it went beyond what the previous guys had done. But the honest truth is it's not been acted on. I think he submitted it in 2015 or something. Okay. Now, I don't know why. I mean, what is stopping? The simplest thing, in my view, would be, let's start with stations. I mean, the running of trains is one thing, the running of stations, completely different thing. I mean, we should just privatize the major railway stations. It's not being done. And privatizing the Victoria terminus, now called the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj terminus, whatever, it's a wonderful building. I mean, it would be a terrific PPP project. And I urge Vinayak, you have a new government in Maharashtra, maybe they can add some kind of persuasion to do that. But there are lots, one can give lots of such examples. I mean, Air India is a good example where something has happened. I mean, but the government quite rightly got rid of what would have otherwise just gone on to get them broke. Let's hope the Tatas make a good job of it. But we need a systematic application of the principle. How much money do we really have for capital investment? And how much capital investment do we need? And if we are serious about Viksit Bharat type projections, we need twice the capital investment than the money we've got. I mean, we don't do medium-term planning anymore, but somebody should do it in government. And the moment you say that, then it has to be that each ministry should be told, what is your privatization plan? That's what we did actually in the 12th plan, because we set up a separate committee and we got Dr. Manmohan Singh to agree to set up a cabinet committee on infrastructure in which the secretariat would be the planning commission, not the cabinet secretary. Cabinet secretary didn't like that idea, understandably. But the main thing we did was we said, let's get every ministry to say what its target is, and let's get them to say how much is public and how much is private. We're not going to tell them do one or the other. I mean, if they can say we're going to do all of it, and that's consistent with the budget they're getting, okay. But it was very clear that they were not going to get that budget. So if you're not going to get that budget, what are you going to do which is private? I think we need to do something like that. And frankly, if you do that, each of the major infrastructure ministries should be told, okay, bhai, what are you planning to do and how much money do you think you're going to get? There isn't a planning commission now, but there is a finance ministry. So you add up, in the first instance, they may say, we're going to do all this in the public sector, and for that we need X lakh crores. Then you just ask the finance ministry, are you going to give them X lakh crores? If they're not going to give them X lakh crores, then you iterate and you would automatically get them directly involved. And what we said we would do is that we would monitor whether the ministry was able to achieve its own targets in the privatization area, and if not, why not? And I think you need that kind of pressure to get things going. There were hundreds of problems. I mean, you know, and I mean, my former colleague, now late Gajendra Haldia, did a lot of work on increasing transparency, which is actually being used even now by the ministry. Ways of how do you invite a bid, transparency in inviting a bid so that you make sure that you're getting a good bid. And once you get a good bid, just allocate it and leave it to these guys. So I think those problems can be resolved. I want to make just one point, and that is the one of the recent chief economic advisors, Arvind Subramaniam, who's now, I mean, he's gone back to academic life, but he writes frequently. You know, he coined a very good phrase in his first year as chief economic advisor. That's when the twin balance sheet problem was there. He sort of said, we face a problem of stigmatized capitalism. Yeah, I remember that. And you know, what it meant really was, it's very difficult to ask people, I mean, if you say, let's do it PPP, you say, oh, private sector, I'm in favor of private sector. But you know, infrastructure private sector is going to be big companies. It's not going to be little things. And I think we are very happy dispensing loans for very small categories, because nobody believes that if you gave a loan to some reserved category person or deprived person or other person, that he applied personal pressure. But giving a loan to a big company requires, you have to be sure that nobody's going to accuse you of having done something wrong. And if every firm that is capable of implementing a project is going to be what Arvind Subramaniam calls stigmatized, then it's going to be very difficult to allot in projects. And I mean, that's not easily solved. It's a cultural thing. It depends on the social pressures, the system, things of that kind. Unless you solve that, I don't think you can have PPP in infrastructure. Because big, serious infrastructure involves companies that are capable of mobilizing several thousand crores. And those are going to be big companies. So the way you allot the thing, I mean, Gajendra was invited by Kerala government when K. Chandrasekhar, who was cabinet secretary here and then went back to Kerala, became an advisor to the Kerala government. The Vizhingham port has been hanging on for years and years and years. And it was a clear case where we needed to develop it as a port that would bring the major shipping lines to come. Otherwise, they were all going to Colombo, and then they were doing offloading into small boats, which would then go to India. And that was actually losing us what would otherwise be called cabotage traffic. Because in all countries, movements from one small port to another small port in the same country is usually sort of kept for the local shipping guys. But here, because it was from an international port, i.e. Colombo, they could use any foreign boat to bring it from Colombo to India. So there was a shipping group interest that, look, you set up a big port that can take big vessels, and then, all the shipping from there to Mundra, from there to Bombay, from there to Cochin would all be done by Indian vessels. Very good case. They did this thing. It cost a lot of money. And the Kerala government didn't have any money, so they wanted to do it private sector. And they got Gajendra Haldia to prepare the bid, and he prepared a whole bunch of bidding documents with great care. And of course, what happened was that there was only one bidder, and that was Adani. So then the government of Kerala got very scared, thinking, how can we allot to one bidder? And I mean, Gajendra dragged out all the rules which said that, look, as long as it's a transparent bid and there's nothing wrong with the bid, there's nothing in government rules that prevents you from giving it to the sole bidder if the bidder is otherwise eligible, which he was. And therefore, Vizhingham Port is being done by Mr. Adani. But, there was lots of unhappiness at whether we'll be criticized. Now, I mean, most people knew that Haldia was such a sort of stickler for the rules that if you caught anyone in Delhi and said, "Ke bhai, ye bidding mein kuch scam hai," and then you told them the documents were done by Gajendra Haldia, they would say, "Nahi, fir scam nahi ho sakta." Because he had this reputation. He'd done a lot of work, and I haven't been. I'd like to go and see the port, actually. Have you been to Vizhingham?
No, I haven't, but can be easily organized. So
Yeah.
We'll take you up on that.
There you are, you see. I really would like to. It wasn't done, as it were, under my watch, because I had stepped down. And it wouldn't have come to me anyway. It was a sector, it's a state government port. But not enough state governments are doing this. I mean, to my mind, for example, privatizing of the discoms is the biggest thing lying around. I mean, they're making humongous losses. And I mean, frankly, if we had state governments that were sufficiently dynamic to pursue PPP options, privatizing the discoms is a big one. I think some action is taking place. Chandigarh, I think, has just been privatized.
The court has just cleared the winning bidder was CESC, Sanjeev Goenka. He won the bid, it was handed over to him. The engineers of Chandigarh went on a 48-hour strike, the city went into blackout, matter went to court, and the court has now just said, hand it over to the winning bidder.
Good, very good. No, because, I mean, personally, I've been saying this to Punjab government guys, that look, you don't have to do it for the whole state. I mean, a state like Maharashtra, for example, Bombay is private, the Bombay Electric Company. They could take Nagpur and some of the surrounding areas, distribution, and privatize.
May I come in on this? So the prevailing policy that is likely to be unleashed, we have heard, is that the government is following a different track. They're doing what you asked, but states are being advised, and I hope you'll see this news soon because we've been told it's kind of almost ready to be announced, is what is called the second licensing. That we are not going to privatize the discom, but we are going to allow private sector to pick any viable cluster and with its own money invest in almost a parallel network because the existing networks are very decrepit, and private sector can choose a certain cluster with a peri-urban or a certain area and be the second licensee, which quite honestly, even with the capex required to duplicate a network, still I've seen some feasibilities, still works out pretty viable. So clearly they're looking at a parallel.
No, but let me put it, this is not a good idea.
Tell us why.
Because I'll tell you why. I mean, what you're doing is, if you're privatizing a discom in an area and you're expecting another company to lay private lines parallel with the ones that the existing discom is laying, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, it makes a lot of sense if you were to privatize the, as it were, the infrastructure and modernize that massively, and then let anybody use it. But to have the existing discom infrastructure, I mean, the way you think it's going to work is basically that, You're going to incur the expenditure of laying parallel lines. You're hoping that all the customers will go to this guy. Then the public sector fellows will say the only reason our lines are bad is that you're not allowing us to invest. And you will say that we are not investing because your losses have been very high. And they'll say, but he's got some money, so forget about the past losses. You improve my lines, I mean, it's just complete. You know, these are, I mean, I can guarantee you it's not going to work.
We'll see. But I'm going to ask you one question.
Do you disagree?
Yeah, okay.
Do you disagree?
I partly disagree because
then let's discuss that.
I'll tell you why. The political head, UP has been trying to privatize major, they've cut up the state into so many different areas. Siraj, you would know about this. And it's been years since state governments, other than Orissa, which at one shot handed over practically the entire state to Tata Power 3 years ago, but single bidder, the tremendous headwinds from the existing unions establishment is such that privatization doesn't seem a political viable option, but market access. After all, airlines were allowed to operate when Air India existed. Telecoms were, so providing market access, which is private players were allowed to come into the market even when VSNL existed. So you're following the principle of allowing market access without privatizing the incumbent public sector player. So the principle I am not against. Whether it can happen or not, it will probably happen in some quarters, it may fail in other quarters, but the principle of providing market access
let's look at it, look at the principle in the following way. I mean, the reason why it worked so well in telecom was that nobody had to lay any lines. I mean, mobiles, I mean, the sort of connectivity is through the air. If you have to lay parallel lines, that doesn't seem to me to be a very sensible way of running an electric distribution system. I mean, what you could do, if you're really concerned, is to pull out the entire the line laying activity into a separate company and allow the public sector discom and some private sector guy to buy electricity and use the common network. But that's too complicated.
It's the problem with the railways, sir. Same thing. You allow private sector to use a network owned by the public sector, it just doesn't work. So, and in many cases...
Well, it works. I mean, in Italy, for example, you have a common network, but you can take a train which is a private train or a public train. And we could do that too. And no reason why we can't.
Let's see how it plays out. It will depend on a hell of a lot of legislative and political support. But
No, once you add that, nothing can happen. Let's be clear. I mean, look, the truth of the matter is, what you need is a political leader who simply starts on the operation that the guys who are voting, whether in the legislative assembly or the parliament, they really don't have much of a mind of their own. So, I mean, if you have a strong leader saying, look, this is what I want to do, and you must support me, they'll all say yes. I mean, otherwise, I mean, frankly, it becomes non-functional otherwise.
So I want to pick up another very, very strong conceptual point, very relevant to us now, is that let's say from 97 onwards till 2024, we've had many lessons learned in PPP, which is largely in what one would call core infrastructure. Roads, power, ports, airports, and throw in telecom there also. Now, lessons have been learned about various models. Model concession agreements as done by Gajendra, hybrid annuity, BOT, BOOT, you name it. We have played around with all kinds of models. And the fact that so much capital has come in and is operating today, I think vindicates that PPP can be made to work. Forget the cycles of ups and downs. The question really is, with this history behind us and the original point that can more private capital be encouraged to come into areas where it can earn a return, can this learning of PPP in core infrastructure, is it now ready for translation into areas which are not seeing capital come in from budgetary outlays? Health, education, nutrition, irrigation, agricultural infrastructure. Can't we now actually switch focus away from core, which has reached a level of maturity, and move to what one would call social and agri-infrastructure with very robust PPP models? But that doesn't seem to be in anybody's consciousness.
No, I mean, look, in principle, it's more difficult when it comes to, it's most difficult when it comes to health. But I would have thought in education, it's not that difficult. You know, elsewhere in the world, they do have things like charter schools. I mean, you take a public sector school and you let a bunch of private people who want to run schools run the school on the understanding that either the fees will be fixed at whatever relevant level or, and we did try this, Gajendra worked on that for Punjab, that, 50% of the students would be on a fixed fee basis and the other 50% would be on a variable fee. And the guys would provide whatever the infrastructure. But the most important thing is that they would actually hire the teachers. And of course, there's very strong resistance from the teachers who are currently civil servants. And since they also man the election booths, they're a very powerful group that nobody wants to annoy. But, frankly, everybody says we're not spending enough money on education. And I think that's true. Most of this money has to be spent by state governments, not by the center, primary schools and all the state government subject. But certainly, if you look at central universities, if the central government wanted, they could introduce PPPs in central universities. That would give an example. Today, what is happening is that a hell of a lot of private universities are coming up. If you look at what students want to do, it's certainly true that the IITs and the top maybe 4 or 5 national universities have a special appeal. But otherwise, the new private universities are attracting students. And in terms of resources, we're not resourcing our universities the way they need to be. And therefore, that's something worth experimenting with.
So I'm now going to ask you a question which is going to be a little uncomfortable for you, but I think it will make for a very interesting discussion.
Very dangerous sort of introduction.
Yeah. Okay. So it goes like this. One of the criticisms leveled against the period of massive PPP, which much of it happened under your watch and Gajendra and other people, in those days, Mr. Chidambaram in the finance ministry and IDFC and all of that, was that you unleashed a program nationally for attracting private capital into infrastructure without full cognizance of the institutional capacity to make it work. Let me explain that a little bit. You put all the model concession agreements, the contracts, etc., were unleashed in a business framework that did not have the institutional capacity of independent regulation, formats for transparent renegotiation, capacity in the lending institutions to be able to hugely determine the nuances of infrastructure legislation, and most importantly, the fact that government itself was the biggest impediment in terms of environment clearances, making land available, etc., etc. So the institutional capacity was neglected, but the urge to get the country going in a positive sense, to unleash formats to get private capital in, was unleashed with far more energy than was devoted to building the institutional capacity required to make that money work. So, your response to that?
No, of course, let's put it this way. On the whole, I'm of the view that you should push a system. If you start saying, let's not do anything until everything is done, please be satisfied with the same per capita income for the next 10 years, okay? Therefore, this is the old argument in development economics, that is balanced growth a good thing or not? And lots of well-known economists said the essence of development is create the pressures of imbalance, push a system, because the system will respond. It won't do it very fast, maybe it will create a bit of problems, but once you face the problem, something will happen. I'm firmly of the view that that's the right thing to do. Now, when you say, did we do enough to develop the institutions? I certainly couldn't have. Because it's really, you can't sort of be pushing something and then telling people this is what you should do. You rely on the system as a whole responding. So that's the short answer. Yes, there was imbalance, but that was not a surprise to me. But let's look at the individual things. See, one, capacity of lending institutions. Now, you know, when these road projects were done, for each road project, we had a kind of what we thought was an appropriate capital investment, okay? And that was there because we were saying that if we are going to give a, if you like, an implicit subsidy, you're going to bid for what subsidy do you want, subject to a maximum of 25% of the estimated capital cost, okay? And that is why that estimated capital cost was there. A lot of people told us in the private sector that, Saab, your estimated capital costs and all, I mean, government estimates and all are not very accurate, it costs more, blah, blah, blah. And of course, in government, you know, estimated capital costs don't matter because you just exceed them anyway. So nobody seriously looks at a capital cost as a budget constraint. Because they say they're used to 3-4 years later, they'll say inflation ho gayi, ye ho gaya, wo ho gaya, revise kar do. Those are valid grounds. But best we could, we did an estimation, we even put in a little bit of extra amount. Then Gajendra discovered that after we had given, the bidding took place, the subsidies were contained by the capital cost because you only get 25% of the approved capital cost, so we were quite happy. But then these fellows would go to the banks, and then they would get loans for the project. And the loans would very often be much higher than the estimated capital cost. Now, this was not our business to pursue, but Gajendra, being a smart, shrewd guy, he brought this to my attention. Okay, bhai, this is going on, and I suspect that all this money is being borrowed from the banks and salted away. I mean,
Gold plating. Gold plating.
That's a polite way of saying it, you know. Gold plating implies that you're building a capital asset which is actually worth the cost, the money you're spending. Salting away means you're saying that's what you're doing, but actually you're not even spending it on that. Okay. So I said to Gajendra, look, as Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, I can't be pronouncing definitively on this, but you raised a valid point. Why don't you prepare a note and we'll send it to the Finance Ministry and to the Reserve Bank? So he did a detailed note, all this stuff, and it was sent, both to the Finance Secretary and to the Reserve Bank. We didn't get much response from the Finance Secretary, but we did get a response 3 years later from the Governor. And the Governor said, you know, we have also noticed that banks are lending too much, but this is part of their privilege. I mean, we're not supposed to do micromanagement of the bank, which is also true. So, I mean, just a good example, it's interesting that we are saying that our banks, which have been nationalized for God knows how long, running a good banking system, can't actually do an investment of a project. I mean, maybe for the first year it may have been difficult, but it would not have been difficult for these banks to get SBI Capital or something to do proper project analysis. Now, you might say that having found that this is not happening properly, should we have stopped the whole thing? Or is it better to let it rip and then see what happens? And I think we did the right thing. We did get some bad projects, but then those things suffered in due course, etc. Environmental clearances, there you're absolutely right. I mean, frankly, you know, that is something that we have just not, and I don't think we've done it now either. We just don't seem to have a way of working out how to sort of make this transparent. Now, you know, it must be said to, what's his name, Jairam Ramesh, who was then Environment Minister, and he was in charge of all these tiger reserves. So one of the things that would happen is that chaps would go to the coal ministry and say, well, we want a coal mine. So they would allocate them a coal mine which is in a tiger reserve. And so, I mean, they shouldn't have. So Jairam said, look, let's have a general policy. No coal mines will be allocated if it's within a tiger reserve. And public sector was not happy with that. I'm sorry, private sector, they're not happy with that. They said, no, I think you should allow flexibility. Flexibility means what? I mean, some of them would say, well, you know, now we have ways of mining which don't disturb the forests, etc. I mean, the other view is that they must be just bribing someone to give them the approval later on. So I think the whole environmental clearance thing is a mess. And I don't know how, I mean, we can't resolve that problem very simply. But I think we need to have a much better way of working out what are we going to allow and what are we not going to allow. But certainly, I think some transparency. I mean, if there is a tiger reserve, we should just say no coal mines will be allotted here, period. And therefore, if somebody wants a coal mine, he should go and get some coal mine somewhere else if it's available. So that's on environment. Regulator, I don't think the regulators are that bad. And all said and done, it's a difficult, I'm not sure any environmental, I mean, any PPP that was seriously held up by regulatory misperformance, if you like. But maybe you have some examples, we can discuss that. I think the last point you made is the ability to renegotiate. That really is tough. And I think, look at it this way. Many private guys, fellows I know to be good fellows, would come and tell me that, sir, please don't call this public-private partnership. Because the moment the contract is signed, there's no partnership. Because you view us as crooks, and we have to do everything that's in the contract, no matter what we say. Nobody will change the terms. And the way the Prevention of Corruption Act at that time was framed, it did say something like, you know, even if you have not taken any bribes, but you've done something which favors the other fellow, you can be held responsible. Now, you know, for us, I think the trouble is a civil servant is always, I mean, he runs a very asymmetric risk because he has to clear 100 projects. 98 of those projects may go very well and be excellent, and one gets screwed up. He'll be caught on the one that gets screwed up. So his incentive has to be that he should not run the risk of falling foul of any regulation. It's very difficult to devise a regulation that does that. So we thought of something, I think Kelkar also had in his report. You know, but there the argument is always, there's usually an argument that you have let it be decided by a committee which includes a retired judge and a retired cabinet secretary or something. Now, the fact of the matter is, no executive power has gone to such people. But if it did, then they would be just as liable to the charge. And remember, if this is referred to you through a process where the ministry has documented for hundreds of wrong reasons that this is totally wrong, it's very difficult to think that an arbitration group would actually concede that it's right. I think I don't have an answer to this problem, but it's a very serious problem. And the only way it can be taken care of, I think, is if the critical decision-making is simply left to the political system and not to the civil servants. That way the civil servants can set up a small cabinet subcommittee or something, and you say that, look, this is the issue, these are the pros, these are the cons, committee may take a view, and let them decide. But of course, I don't think they'd be happy with that either, because in a political system where everybody can be accused, then immediately the direction will be, who were the guys on that committee and why did they do what they did? So I think we have a problem.
So now that you have so happily acceded to my raising uncomfortable points, I'm going to raise one more. Across the conversation with you and with anybody on PPP, anybody, including you, the name Gajendra Haldia will crop up. I have personally I worked very closely with him, as you know, and I also stuck my neck out to do an article in Business Standard called Who's Afraid of Gajendra Haldia? Deep respect for him, and may he rest in peace, because his attention to detail, his knowledge, and his steadfastness against many other kind of forces was outstanding. However, there's a criticism leveled against you that, and many other, particularly amongst the IAS officer brethren, and some intellectual infrastructure thinkers institutionally, that the wall that Gajendra Haldia built around you with himself did not allow other thoughts and ideas to permeate to you, and that Gajendra Haldia effectively stalled widespread debate and discussion, one because of what was perceived as his own intellectual arrogance, and secondly, because by and large there was this perception that you would listen to what Gajendra Haldia said. So there was this contradiction that at one level there was this huge respect for the guy, and at the other level there was this fact that he completely controlled the discourse on PPP and infrastructure development, and that you didn't listen to others. Now, what is?
I mean, look. First of all, you will never be impartial about a criticism about yourself, and since I'm sufficiently far from it, I'd be quite happy to be told, you know, you goofed. Let me say that it's not true that the opposing views didn't come to me. They invariably did. And I must say that on technically, Gajendra was almost never in the wrong. I must tell you that on many occasions, I told ministers that, look, he's the representative of the Planning Commission in a committee chaired by the secretary. If everybody disagrees with him, just record that. Gajendra was very insistent that you can overrule me, but please record my views. I'm afraid we are running a system in which senior civil servants in such a committee, basically they're not happy overruling someone. Because they feel कि अरे यार गजेंद्र अगर ये तुम सब लिख दोगे तो हमें problem आ जाएगी. So he said, sir, what do you want me to do? I'm not holding it up. And even I told certain ministers that please tell your secretaries that if they're satisfied, overrule Gajendra Haldia. And I even said, I promise I won't raise it in cabinet. Okay, well, I was a special invitee. The only time this actually worked was in the railways, where Gajendra helped to devise the Marora and the other diesel and electric engine project. He had made a large number of, I thought, extremely valid points, and the railways were absolutely opposed to all of them. So I said to Gajendra, look, we have to compromise. So I'm going to ask the Prime Minister to set up a committee under Chidambaram. And the railway guy can come, and I will come, and you won't be speaking. But I'm going to concede some of those points in the interest of getting on with the job, and maybe he'll concede some to me. And Chidambaram will preside over the whole thing. And Gajendra came along to brief me. And that's exactly what happened. Now, you know, some of the points were very simple. Like, for example, you are proposing a system where if you exceed the time set for the delivery, we are going to impose a penalty. Okay, that's very good. Gajendra said that, look, we should also have a system where if you do it faster, you'll get a reward. They said no. And Gajendra said, look, if you do a general equilibrium analysis, if you allow this to happen, then in the bidding, it'll be reflected and they will give you better terms. If you deny them all these upsides, you'll get worse terms. So it's not as if you're losing. But nobody in the railways were willing to make a concession. Now you tell me, as an economist, he was absolutely right. But sometimes you have to concede in the system of learning. The other problem in the railways was that, you know, the financial commissioner changed every year. And these are complex projects. So every time a year passed, the new financial commissioner wanted to take another look at the whole thing. Still, we managed to get it done, but it's very sad that the UPA weren't actually able to invite the bids on these projects that were called, but to the credit of the successor government, I mean, the bids were invited by the NDA, I mean, the Modi 1 government which took over. Projects were awarded and they're functioning. And quite frankly, you know, yeah.
I stuck with it from 2006 to 2015.
As
Madhepura got built.
Oh, okay.
You were the country head of Alstom.
How did it go?
Sir, if I may say, I can say this publicly, long retired, so are you. He won't remember, but he triggered things I can say that clearly. With a simple question such as, what will it take for a company like yours to participate in India to build plants of the scale of a BHEL? That was a challenge question in 2006. In railways, it was Mr. Batra who was the chairman of the railway board. Similar question separately to say, we are happy to have you participate with equity. And I still remember the words clearly. I remember the month was October 2006. And I almost fell off the chair in the chairman's office. What if we gave you 74% equity? I said, excuse me? And 26 railway? Yes. But we'll have to cap it at 100 crores for 26%. Otherwise, XYZ, Cabinet Committee on Infrastructure, etc., will play in, and there will be delays if you agree. And he talked the same way to Siemens and GE and everyone else. And I participated in almost 100% of all the meetings of Mr. Gajendra Haldia from that day on till the first time the bids were called in 2009. Unfortunately, Achar Sanghita stepped in. February of 2009. And the tenders were postponed. A variety of reasons, they carried on for another 5 years, postponing. And I can tell you that we finally did pop the champagne in Paris 9 years later.
There you are.
And a big example of, I mean, I don't want to get into too much detail because it has other issues, but the way the privatization of Delhi airport, ultimately the turns that it took. So we are all aware of that, where Gajendra Haldia's seminal dissent note changed the course of the privatization of Delhi airport. But now let's move away because this is something that, can carry on. I want to ask you another question.
But I'm glad, let me say for the record, that having brought out what I know is a gut reaction of many of your government colleagues frustrated at Gajendra Haldia, you allowed me to put it in a certain context. And we've got some examples where it worked well. So, and this is, small things, the huge involvement of major companies in producing diesel engines. It's massive. There you are.
So now I'm actually, critics of PPP today refer to this point, and I want your reaction on this, saying in many of the sessions where PPP was pushed by the international institutions like the World Bank and ADB and others, British systems were held up as an epitome of how PPP institution building should be done. Their famous 3P office, Ofwats for water, British rail privatization under Thatcher, etc. The funny thing now is that many of them have come to have serious credibility problems. British Rail, the operations are getting renationalized. The British public want water renationalized, and evidently the epitome of PPP handling is no more what was held out to be, and that is a very significant criticism, saying, look, the country that was touted as having the best institutional capacity for PPP is floundered. What the hell do you expect us to do on PPP now?
No, I think that's a very, that's a very valid point, that this point is made. And certainly British Rail is quoted frequently as an example that, I think the short answer is, things can always go wrong. But the fact that things can go wrong, if you just followed a public sector model, some things would be going wrong. So here, yes, some things go wrong. You have to work out whether it would happen in your case also. I didn't think that we would privatize all of Indian rail operations. But certainly, for example, Concor. Why can't you privatize Concor? And today, we want the private sector to come in with logistics companies. And I've written elsewhere on climate change that we should encourage, the railways will now be going electric, which is good. We should encourage more private sector companies to do the kind of, if you like, the direct connection, last mile connection with customers, put in the sort of technology where you can know where your packet is moving, et cetera, et cetera. For this, private logistics companies have to make a lot of investment. They will only make the investment if they are sure that they are getting a level playing field vis-a-vis Concor in the movement of containers. The only way they'll be sure is if you privatize Concor. If you don't privatize Concor, nobody in his right mind will believe that they will be given equal treatment. And as a result, you're not going to get the sort of logistics investment that we need. Now, interestingly, now we recognize that logistics is a problem. I mean, all the relevant fellows are saying we must do breakthroughs. But this particular point is sort of left hanging.
Railway establishment again, tremendous resistance.
It's not a matter of railway establishment. Is the railway establishment capable of resisting a political decision? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So you've got to get a decision at the political level. Otherwise, after all, that's what Margaret Thatcher did.
Sir, I completely agree what you said just now. The most important feature which I would like to mention with respect to public-private and partnership, the arena to which we are discussing, this was discussed by Professor.
Yourself so people know.
I'm Umesh Prasad Singh, an associate member of the Indian Institute of Public Administration. Okay. So, sir, what I would like to focus that public-private and partnership, what we are discussing, this was very rightly mentioned by Professor Amartya Sen in his very famous research that he did also on welfare economics. That he spoke about the welfare of the people. The way we are discussing, we need to harmonize and the holistic approach. That is the most important thing which we should take up for the welfare of the people. That's what you discussed, and I really, it's really appreciable. This is what I mentioned.
I think now that questions have started coming from the House, I think one of the reasons many of you are here is an opportunity to also interact and not just. So I'm actually going to throw the House open, and please use this forum. It's one of those rare occasions when we get to air our views and thoughts with Montek. So here, I've got a hand up. Sir, please introduce yourself. And my only request is, many hands will come up. Please keep your questions and your interjections brief.
Myself, Jagveer Rawat, and I want to ask a question on a very different track. That's public cooperative partnership. And that's an innate institutional situation, at least in Amul and some districts like Banaskantha. It's a very good evolutionary story, public cooperative partnership in the wake of the new ministry we have. And we see a very good ecosystem of innovation developing in that one district. Even I can say 1 crore liter milk is processed by the district milk union in a day, in November and December. And the district milk union itself is kind of a brand other than Amul. So my question is, the public cooperative partnership, which has a very good ecosystem, vaccine and embryo transfer, and even small problems. I myself was involved into 3 problems, like innovation in embryo transfer technology. So there is a case for public cooperative partnership.
Okay. I think the question is on cooperatives as a tool for public-private partnership.
No, there's no question. The Amul model, the milk cooperatives model is a success. And it does work quite well with the government if you have a good state government keen to do it. And maybe it can even go beyond milk. For example, I think in Maharashtra, all the strawberry production. The key to this thing is either cooperatives or, farmer-producer organizations. The suspicion of cooperatives is that they get politically captured. Farmer-producer organizations don't. So if you want to call it generally FPOs, we should be able to make a lot of progress in many areas. Yeah.
The FPOs 2002, 2013, 2x. But the best use cases are only from National Dairy Development Services.
Yes.
Use the mic.
The FPOs which were formed on the Amul model, they went from 500 crore to 2,000 crore. The rest, which were following other format, National Dairy Development Services itself is a consultancy organization. That follows the same ecosystem as Amul's ecosystem. Rest is failure.
Okay. I think we'll go on to the, if you can pass the mic to the gentleman here.
I'm Srinath, sir. It's a semi-personal question you can answer at the end. I've seen you contributing so much to the 1991 liberalization, and after that, next 25 years, me growing you, watching in the remote corner of Andhra Pradesh. This personal question is, can we see you contributing more to the Vikshit Bharat in your life going forward?
No, I didn't get that. What?
So the question he has is that you made such seminal contributions in your time, his expectation is that you in some way you continue to do so. That's his more,
Well, I
a
mean,
wish and a question.
let's put it this way. First of all, thank you for saying these very nice things. You know, at my age, it's nice to hear that. I'm not sure that, I don't think I have as long as I have reasonable health and I'm around, I do plan to keep kind of focusing on these issues. What I want to do, quite honestly, is to write a different kind of book, not the sort of thing that deals with all this complex stuff, but something that will make younger people realize what is it that's going to be relevant for them. And I personally think, and this is something I kind of got a bit from my wife also, because she dealt with the urban situation, which was a complete mess, probably still is. But she found that when she went around the country, there were lots and lots of little examples which seemed to be working very well. And she wrote a series of articles. This is not research, but kind of good journalism, which she published under the title Postcards of Change, which I thought was quite good. And it made you, this is the truth about India, that you take any issue, and you will find that there are individual examples that will tell you that the sky's the limit. But then you average it out, and I'm afraid it's not good. Look, this young man, Gukesh, who's become the world chess champion, he's an example of basically, he doesn't come from any elite background, although he comes from middle to upper middle class background, professional parents, but in some small part of the country. He's not sitting in Bangalore, he's not in Tech City, he's not in Chennai, and so on. And I don't think he went to IIT either, but he's become world champion. That means that, the capacity of, and all these guys in the cricket team, when I was young, all the cricket team guys were children of Nawabs and all. It was just assumed that only the very upper classes could play cricket. But that's visibly not the case. The place is full of, and these women cricketers and another bunch. So there's a lot around the country. There's a lot of potential. The only question is, what are the environments that would essentially make these sources of dynamism actually flourish? And I have a feeling that, the government has a very big role in that, but not a kind of cloying, detailed planning role. And if the government, a lot of when I say government here is not central government, it's state government. We're not 90% of the discussion on policy in this country is on central government policy. That's because all the intellectuals want a job in the central government. It's amazing that none of these guys lobby the state government. I don't know why,
It's not fashionable. It's not fashionable.
It's not fashionable.
It's not fashionable. You have to be in Delhi and give gyan to government, and your status,
More fashionable.
your status is defined in the pecking order. It's kind of. But anyway, sir, you have a.
The name's Alok Jain, a retired bureaucrat. How often has renegotiation been demanded in major projects, and how has it been managed in the last 10, 15 years? And is this in any way linked to the demand for salting aside a certain amount of money? Is it linked in any way?
I don't think we have any kind of structured mechanism for renegotiation. When Gajendra Haldia was sort of working on this, one can always identify a string of external circumstances which may justify renegotiation. For example, you link something to world prices, how much are world prices going to increase, etc. You can do that. But somebody told me that, it's impossible to anticipate in advance the many, many things that can go wrong. And many of the things that go wrong just require an executive decision. I mean, look, if you were, I don't know, Mr. Mukesh Ambani or Mr. Adani or Mr. Tata or whoever, Chandrasekharan now, and you're setting up some power plant somewhere, and you were to call back and say, something has happened, unexpected, a bridge has collapsed or something else has happened, so it's going to be delayed. And you have to either condone that delay or you have to sort of do something in order to enable me to compensate and so on. In any company, I mean, they would just do it. In the government, there is no one who's authorized to do that.
There was a recent case a couple of years ago of the CRC conceding a higher tariff, was it to Reliance and Adani, because of increase in imported coal.
Ultra mega.
prices. But this was done by the CRC and not a change in the contract. Is
Wasn't
the
that,
right-
by the way, shot down later on by a court?
No, not that I.
Yeah, okay, well, that's good if they're doing that kind of.
I think it's all right to
But
go beyond the law,
maybe
but it is
one of the problems, I mean, I'll give you an example of where things go wrong, okay? I forget now in detail, but there was a power project, okay? And the power project, built into that power project, was a condition that any change of law, the adverse effect on the producer will have to be compensated. Sound quite good. Now, this project involved getting coal from their own mine in Indonesia and bringing it into India, okay?
So I'm aware of this one, sir.
Yep.
So the funny thing in this contract, which is the ultra mega, the imported Indonesian coal,
Yeah.
where royalty was suddenly imposed on
Yes.
by Indonesia,
Yes.
and that threw the economics out of gear. The contract said, very funnily, now this goes back to the lawyers, the contract had a force majeure clause for change of law in India, and the contract did not have a clause for force majeure change of law abroad. And the Supreme Court then held up the sanctity of the law and the contract. That was Supreme Court's view on the matter. Then it went back to CERC. Subsequently, many state governments who were buyers of power because they needed the power, then increased the rates. But it was a very complex legal contractual issue, which then Supreme Court said that our job is to uphold the sanctity of a signed contract. And it didn't say force majeure internationally. It said force majeure in Indian laws.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, but this is, in other words, the change was agreed to at a certain level, shut down by the court system. But, you could say, by the way, I mean, a good lawyer on the other side would say that, listen, these guys had access to the best lawyers. So this is not a case where somebody wrote the contract in the back of his envelope. So if they said change in Indian law, they must have meant change in Indian law. That meant that change in the Indonesian law is not covered, period. So you take the risk. I mean, it's a good, I'm glad you raised, I don't know whether this is exactly the case you had in mind, but.
It is.
Well, but then what you said CERC did, but the court shut it down.
I could be wrong there, but the CRC did agree to.
CERC agreed, the states objected. The buyer states objected. CERC was actually keen to pass the tariff through.
Look, I think
But we'll have a separate chat on that, otherwise.
We have a legal system where, for example, you enter into an agreement for arbitration, let's say, okay? You can easily get out of that by simply alleging corruption. If a contract is entered into, I mean, I'm not referring to a specific case, if a contract is entered into which involves some protection from a state government, okay? And the guy concerned sort of comes up and saying, look, these circumstances now triggered. And if the state government is willing to say, to argue that, look, there was fraud in the signing of this contract, they don't actually have to prove the fraud. The mere allegation of fraud basically means that now you can't go for arbitration because arbitration won't cover a situation where an allegation of fraud is made. And so, of course, one view would be that, look, the Indian legal system must first pronounce. And if the Indian legal system finds that there is no fraud and you're exonerated, it's okay. And if you said, and this will take 3 months, nobody would mind. But consult any lawyer. If any international company were to ask the question that if there's an allegation of fraud, how long would the Indian legal system take? 10 years. So, you know, from the investor's point of view, and by the way, we have introduced in our BITs recently, I don't know whether this was Chidambaram or subsequently, we've said that, look, we are not prepared for investor-state disputes in arbitration to take place unless you first completely exhaust the provisions under Indian law. Now, on the face of it, all it says is that, look, it's covered by Indian law. Don't go to arbitration unless you completed the Indian legal process. But if the Indian legal process is going to take 10 to 15 years, what is the signal the investor gets? So forget it. I mean, I'm not really interested. So, and the problem is these are not dealt, I mean, the power ministry may well be aware of it. But this requires pretty high level decision making in the government where somebody has to say that, look, what is it that we want? You've seen what's happening, for example, in these FTA agreements. We did something, now the Swiss have gone and done something else. Now our chaps are saying, hey, this is going to affect me. So, you know, I think we need to recognize that these are all interconnected. I mean, we can't simultaneously expect to bring in a hell of a lot of foreign investment in critical areas. Now remember, in some of these PLI things, if you are going to cover 50% of the capital cost, and the state is going to cover 20% of the capital cost, then the only capital cost that they have at stake is 30%. It's your stake, okay? And secondly, they control all the IPR. They'll come. Because if you muck that project up, you're just mucking yourself up big time. I mean, because you spent all this money and you want to get some results out of it. But if it's a regular kind of project where a person is putting in money, expecting to get a return, etc., most foreign investors want to be assured that contract enforcement is good.
May I comment on that, sir, on one point, and this is a very important discussion we are having. To answer your question numerically, sir, I once had, and I'm happy to say, had this discussion with Gajendra Haldia, where I took a World Bank report to him, which said statistically that a review of PPP projects all over the world revealed that 70% of PPP contracts were renegotiated in the first 5 years of their life. That's as serious a problem as Montek rightly said, that it is impossible in a PPP contract for any sane man or a lawyer or a businessman to envisage all possible scenarios and outline remedial action. So you do get a black swan event from the side which nobody can predict, and therefore there must be a renegotiation which is transparent and fair. But I mean, we can keep discussing this point. The other important point for India is, and I recently investigated this because this was brought to me by Param Iyer, who is now India's representative in the World Bank. Interestingly, we are all familiar with World Bank, IFC and MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee, as arms of the World Bank. But most of us in India are not aware of another institution the World Bank has called ICSID, which is the International Council for Settlement of International Disputes. 158 member countries of the World Bank are signatories to ICSID, and India isn't. Ask me why, and we'll discuss that outside the room, because the Indian bureaucracy is afraid of a whole lot of stuff that we have done with retrospective legislation and not being caught on the wrong foot, etc. So it's, as India is growing, and you're asking foreign...
You can't do this outside the room.
No, we'll do it inside the room. No, inside the room. No, so inside the room. Our system, our political bureaucratic system is afraid that many decisions that we take which are questionable, Vodafone tax case, for example, or Cairn Energy, if it had gone to ICSID, the government may have lost. So there is this fear of signing up, but as Montek said, you're in a state now where you're asking for foreign direct investment in large chunks. More importantly, Indian investors are investing abroad in fairly large chunks of capital. So not being a member of World Bank's ICSID, to my mind, is dysfunctional, and therefore, I mean, sane voices should speak up for that. But having said it, so these discussions can go on and on. On Ultra Mega, there were two projects. One was Reliance Sasant, domestic coal with a captive, no issues, runs very efficiently. The other was Tata Power. These were the only two, and Tata Power had imported coal. But we'll, look at it differently. Now, I have a question from Praveen Khangta. Praveen.
Hi, Mr. Ahluwalia. Praveen, I work in a philanthropic foundation. I hope that before you retire, we see another M document from you. But my question to you is like slightly more selfish, right? You've talked about the government, you talked about the market participants. What is the role that you think for think tanks, for foundations in this specific area? Is there, for example, a research agenda for the next 5 years? The kind of questions that you talked about require very high degree of technical capacity within the government. Is there a role that foundations, think tanks can play? And are there certain questions in your mind which may be helpful for the next 5 to 10 years? You're also associated with a think tank, so even putting that hat on.
No, I mean, look, clearly think tanks can play a role. I mean, look, frankly, the big problem with think tanks, and I'm sort of what is called a distinguished fellow at one of the think tanks. I don't run it, and I'm not really, it's not a full-time thing. But the biggest problem with think tanks is that your friends in industry do not want to fund independent think tanks. These poor guys can only get money from foreign donors, and in all countries, that leaves them very open to question, and that's happening right now, as you can see. Now, if we are going to be, whatever, the third largest country in the world, and we will shortly, it's a disgrace that we don't have think tanks that don't rely on foreign money. I'm not objecting to, if you want to set up some institution to help some low-level, not low-level, but minimal level health and that kind of, fine. But a policy think tank, in my view, should not be funded by a foreign institution. But we have no dearth of industry guys who are willing to fund universities abroad, set up chairs abroad. You try and get some money for them from Indian think tanks. Now, one of the problems, by the way, is that they don't seem to value at all that creating independent opinion, not academic, but think tank opinion in favor of one or other policy would be good for Indian business. They're quite happy doing the lobbying that they do with their own internal think tank. Internal think tanks are not think tanks. They are just sort of, they're good lobbying operations. But I'm absolutely convinced that we need these think tanks. Fortunately, we have a few, but I can tell you when I talk to them, the biggest problem is they can't get much money from local funders. And they now, quite rightly, I think, want to avoid getting foreign funding. So,
Praveen, I have to say, has been very humble. He represents one of the most successful and valued think tanks, which is the Convergence Foundation that has set up Ashoka University and has done many, many other things. So he's one of the pillars of that establishment. But having said it, I'm going to go to the gentleman there.
Ashoka University is wonderful. That's a university.
Yeah, but it's set up with...
Sorry? Slowly.
We ourselves are a beneficiary, sir. The Infravision Foundation that has invited you today, sir, we are beneficiaries of local funding to be.
Good.
And hopefully more is coming. So.
But this is an example, by the way, of capacity building. Because, we need to push for policy, even if think tanks are going to take another 5-6 years to be funded. Hopefully it will happen.
Yeah, the gentleman there, please.
So my name is Dr. Rajesh Saigal. I'm a Chief Legal Officer Energy Business with Adani Group. So my primary question is basically with regard to dispute settlement in infrastructure projects. We all know that our courts is already overloaded, and in between I think government has taken initiative of bringing the utility bill resolution of dispute way back in 2020. I don't know what's happened that. But there is no such institutional mechanism so far in India which address the actual infrastructure, especially the construction dispute, because that actual played a delay and which caused, we know many projects, like for example, if I quote Reliance recently, Reliance Metro case. The first time in commercial arbitration, curative petition has been provoked in Supreme Court. I don't know, I mean, who has that sense of judgment that commercial arbitration or curative petition in commercial matters has been invoked? But it's really shook the investment confidence altogether. Coming to bilateral investment treaty, everybody knows that once they are coming to India, how much the system is well equipped with handle infrastructure projects. So I think there should be some institutional mechanism where only infrastructure disputes can be addressed with a capacity building where the people who actually understand the infrastructure can address that issues.
That if you're going to run a private sector system, which we are, and if you're also going to have foreign investors coming in, which we do need, then high quality contract dispute resolution has to be top of the bill. Yep. Now, it's massively ignored in government. Most of the legal training, some of the IAS officers do get legal training, but a lot of that is dealing with law and order kind of problems. I mean, contract stuff is very complex stuff. And the other thing is that, with the way technology is changing, you can see that in the United States, that if you're going to get digitalization, AI, tech firms, I mean, this is going to change much faster than anybody is able to understand. And we need some guys advising the government on how to conduct the various international negotiations. He mentioned, for example, that we are not a member of something or the other. Now, one of the problems here is that I think we had the right approach initially, that the way to go is multilateral trade negotiations. But the way the system has worked, people have lost faith in them. At least the big guys have lost faith in them, okay? So we are faced with a situation where they have written off the multilateral trading system. Some of them blame us also, because their view is that we like multilateral trading because it doesn't require you to do a deal, because it requires consensus. So therefore you can hold up anything by just not agreeing. And their view is that we are more concerned with not getting a deal than with doing a deal. So we are the exact opposite of Mr. Trump. We don't believe in the art of the deal. We believe in not letting deals happen. So what has happened? Everybody is now negotiating in what is called plurilateral fora. Outside the WTO, but 100 countries agree on something. We are not even joining these discussions on the grounds that we will only join in the multilateral forum. But if the rest of the world is making its rules happily, in the end, do we really believe that they will ultimately say, oh dear, India wasn't included, let's cancel these rules and at the most, they'll say, but you're very welcome to join. But you will have to join on the rules that have been agreed. So I don't see why we are staying out. In fact, the correct thing for us to do is to join, do whatever we can to make it reasonable, and in the last minute, if we don't want to join, we can stay out. But we're not even joining. Now, I'm not an expert on what's happening on trade negotiations, but what I'm surprised at is neither the legal community nor the industrial community is actually raising these issues. And these are not issues that are critical of the government. I mean, after all, what the government is saying, I mean, top guys in government are saying, we want to do better in exports, wonderful. We want to be part of the global value chain, wonderful. We want to invite foreign investment, wonderful. Somebody should say that if you want to do all these things, this is what you should do. And let your ministries tell you whether they're doing the same thing, and if not, why not? And then they should discuss with industry. I don't find industry engaged in it at all. And I think you need, if some of you guys are either from industry or relate to industry, I think you need to get them, it's in their interest really, and it's not happening.
Okay, so I'm supposed to wind up the session at 8:30. It's almost going to be 8:40. So I'm going to take one last question from Sunand and then we'll close the session. Sorry, you were wanting to come in. Crisp, very quickly, and then Sunand, and no more questions after that. You can give it to him.
Sir, I want to add up on the questions regarding the
Will
foundation.
you introduce yourself, please?
Sir, my name is Bhuvneshwar. I'm lawyer and founder of the Law Awareness Society organization. So, related to the foundation and the NGOs, NGOs and foundations plays very important role in the development of the nation. So, sir, like if any student on their level wants to start any organization, and if any businessman want to start their foundation, sir, the student have to also pay the same amount during the registration. Like when I was in my student, so this need to be changed according to you.
Okay, that's a bureaucratic
No,
thing.
I mean, make a representation to the relevant ministry.
Yeah, this is the last question.
More in the nature of listening and, sir, it goes back to even older times, the time of GE in the 1980s and 90s. The thing we discovered in all this 40 years of doing it, institutional memory and the person across the table from the government facing us and the upgradation of knowledge of that person rather than us. I mean, we were always constant. The opposing person was revolving door. So how Australia solved it, University of New South Wales created a chair for PPP, believe it or not. I mean, I knew the first professor there. And that came out of the Sydney Harbour Tunnel experience. And that could be something which could be done here. And one more for the record for you, a conversation with your colleague Surya Prakash Sethi resulted in the...
Who?
Surya Prakash Sethi. NTPC bulk tender, all the factories got built. So India now has about 40,000 megawatts a year production capacity against the 5,000 that was there in 2006. It works.
Okay. On that happy note, it works, sir. We are ending this. We are ending the seminar on that. Those two words.
Very good.
It works. And no, we'll close the session. Oh, sorry. So thank you very much. Any closing words from you, Montek, before we just all...
No, I just want to say that thank you for inviting me, and I'm not fully aware of what the current policies, etc. are. So you should view my reactions as those of an interested outsider. But what I'm really struck by is that we have a lot of people with a legal background, and actually, my own experience was that, say, compared to the United States, where the lawyers are very much in, neither is government, in those days, government was never informed by really good legal opinion. In fact, most of us, when we were involved in the budget, we would have something on the file which laid out, what we thought was needed. And then it was sent to the law ministry. And nobody actually sat down and said, have they done what you want? And my son, who's a lawyer, frequently tells me the trouble with you economists is that you think you want a law which does this, but you don't subject the draft that comes back from the law ministry to a critical examination. Does it really do this? Do all kinds of other things. And I'm glad that there are people now taking an interest. And there's even a thing, I think this Vidhi Legal Center is doing some work, etc. I think we need a lot more of that kind of stuff. But I give you one wonderful example of Indian industry ignoring law. Because, in the old days, during Narasimha Raoji's period, there was a feeling that if you've tied up with a foreign investor, and you have an investment with him, he shouldn't be allowed to dump you and set up another company. Because, very many of them had agreed to 40% equity, and we are now allowed 51% normal. So a lot of these guys went to their domestic partners and said, look, we want 51%. And the domestic partner said, look, I don't want to give you 51%. So obviously they felt that there was a risk that the chaps would go away and set up another company. So they were actually allowed, government at that time sort of trying to moderate antipathy, said, okay, you can only set up another company if you have the approval of the original one. I mean, to do so, otherwise you're not. And there was one case where a person had signed up with a Korean company to produce refrigerators. And the Korean company wanted to set up another company to produce refrigerators. And this lot said, look, I mean, you've got a legal signed contract with us, so we can't have you do this. So they said, no, you look at the contract. The contract says, we give you the exclusive right to produce this model of refrigerator. We're producing a different model now. Now, you know, if they had a halfway decent lawyer read that contract, he would have told them that, look, if you really don't want the guy to do any other refrigerator, you better phrase it this way. I mean, as we get into big bucks, it has to have a much higher quality of legal input. Now, the government also needs the same thing, and they don't. But then, you know, my legal friends tell me that the government will never be able to get good legal advice because you can't afford to pay for good lawyers.
Thank you, sir. Okay. And a round of applause for Montek, please. That was a lovely conversation, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed yourself too.
Yeah.
I think Kaveri has come to the conclusion that you have a shortage of shawls in your wardrobe. Right? So I don't know because she's bringing one for you.
Also, sir, most lawyers were in the government or are in the government.
So thank you very much. Just a token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
And you're joining us for dinner.
What do you do when it's hot?
You keep it in the cupboard on top, right on top. And you take it out after Diwali.